So hello, everyone. I hope you enjoyed those table discussions. It's now my pleasure to welcome our next keynote speaker, Paige Olmsted. She'll be speaking about some of the challenges and opportunities in implementing natural assets and nature-based solutions. Paige is an environmental scientist whose research focuses on how we account for, make decisions about, and value nature. At the Smart Prosperity Institute, Paige leads the Conservation Finance Initiative, examining financial mechanisms and enabling conditions to catalyze interest and investment to support ecosystem services and the natural environment. Paige enjoys working with a range of stakeholders to address conservation challenges, including local communities, NGOs, various scales of government, academia, and the private sector. She holds a PhD from the Institute of Resources, Environment, and Sustainability at UBC and a Master's of Environmental Science and Policy from Columbia University. So thank you very much, Paige, and over to you.
Thanks. And I'm now seeing what the other speakers saw, I think. So I'm assuming you can all hear me and see my screen, but since I can't see any of you, please let me know if that is not the case. While we're waiting to make sure that that is indeed what's happening, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat people, and many other diverse First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people. I work for the Smart Prosperity Institute, which is a think tank that's based in Ottawa, although I happen to be in Toronto. And a lot of our work spans, has sort of a federal policy audience in mind, but we also do a lot of regional work that includes municipal and more local and regionally based actions as well. Today, I'm going to speak on scaling natural infrastructure, policy challenges and opportunities. And by scaling, I mean not only let's see more of this in action in Canada, but also what's directly tied to that is also scaling funding for that. And so I think there's a few threads that will arise from the various presentations that we've seen already this morning, and hopefully I can help bring some of that together. Overall, and this is not news to anyone, we understand that nature-based solutions play a big role when we think about addressing climate change, both adaptation and mitigation. And we've heard about the different types of ecosystem services that natural capital provides. And from just a strictly GHG perspective, we know that investing in nature-based solutions, and by that I mean the real umbrella term, so we're thinking about conservation, we're thinking about restoration and sustainable resource management, so best management practices in agriculture, for example. And land management really can relate to 30% of the solution when we think about reaching GHG targets, but it's about 10% of the conversation and about 3% of the funding. And so I think, even though I think are largely speaking or preaching to the converted, people that understand the value of nature, it's about how do we mainstream some of these concepts so that it's not just something that happens within the conversation of an environmental ministry or a natural resource ministry, but is a big part of what we think about from an infrastructure standpoint, from across different sectors and municipalities, and a big part of our conversation moving forward, because it really is foundational and integral to being a resilient community. So this also is just kind of a broad illustration of the various ways that we could call natural assets or ecosystem services are sort of relevant in the context of water management. And I know drought it's sort of the too much or too little conversation. And so as I mentioned, in those same types of categories, forestry and agriculture is thinking about what are those appropriate best management practices to deliver water when and where you need it, how different types of restoration activities, be it peatlands or wetlands, across rivers, on coasts, how we actually manage water once we have it in terms of stormwater management, and then also actions that can happen within cities. And this is where you can get into some of the more sort of blended gray, green infrastructure actions like green roofs, how we think about urban canopies, and some of the things that were spoken about in the earlier presentations. And so overall, something that I think has been mentioned but worth thinking about is when we invest in nature, it's not only to improve our ability to mitigate some of these challenges, it also increases our adaptive capacity. And so when we're factoring in the value of some of these assets, that the reducing the current costs as well as saving long-term costs is something that we need to consider. And so speaking of costs, there's a ton of projections out there, and they're all big numbers, but just to highlight a couple, there have been some recent studies that have estimated that municipalities will need to invest over $5 billion annually to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. Nature-based solutions, as has been discussed in a variety of ways, reduce the impact of floods and natural disasters, and climate-related water disasters alone rose to $28 billion of expenditures between 2000 and 2017. This was a recent study that was sponsored by the Insurance Bureau of Canada. And also, there's a lot of different studies on this, and it depends, at the scale that you're looking at and the type of natural infrastructure that you're talking about. But in terms of cost effectiveness, the cost or the benefit cost ratio can range. It can be higher, but between 3 and 6 to 1 in terms of your overall return on investment. And so all of this to say that we understand that thinking about nature as an asset, particularly in a municipal context, makes a lot of sense. And so why aren't we doing a better job of it? Or why aren't we seeing it at scale in the way that you might expect? And so I just wanted to highlight here, these are 3 recent reports that have come out of the Smart Prosperity Institute, so I realize it's slightly biased, but just to highlight this issue, that even if you're talking about different jurisdictional levels, many of the policy challenges and barriers are quite similar. So first, the Invest in Nature report, it looked at different strategies to scale investment in nature across Canada, focused on restoration, conservation, and specifically agriculture and forestry. And it looked at novel financing mechanisms. And we found that some of these underlying issues that I'll highlight on the next slide, when it comes to data, when it comes to novelty and the way that we mandate information is tracked, is a major hindrance, despite, as Anastasia highlighted, available capital potentially if there's the right types of projects designed in the right way to attract that capital. The next report is one that just came out a couple months ago about health co-benefits, and Roy sort of hinted at this. And what we were looking at here was how different city plans across Canada integrate health considerations in relation to how they're investing in nature. And so we looked at the different ways that health outcomes are tied to the way that we invest in natural assets, which is quite well understood, but how much of that are we actually tracking? And how much of that actually helps influence decisions? Because healthcare costs are so high and expected to increase, and there's a lot of investments that make sense at a local level. And the obvious challenge here is that a lot of these investments are happening at a municipal scale, but of course, health is under provincial jurisdiction. And so it's a good illustration, I think, of how there's this sort of benefit cost mismatch. So the cost could be happening at a municipal level. And of course, health isn't the only benefit, but of green spaces or even of wetlands and what people have access to nature. And then where that cost savings is being accrued. And are there ways that you can connect those dots to all of a sudden make some of those investments look more attractive? And what's interesting about this is it was actually Health Canada that approached us to do this project. So they want to be part of this conversation about what's happening at more local levels. So there is, I think, potential for more of this cross-jurisdictional collaboration and interaction. This last one is a case study that we did in collaboration with the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. And this is actually a case in Calgary and Alberta in general. So we talk about the wetland policy, the provincial wetland policy in Alberta, but also the changes that Calgary made in response to the 2013 floods. And again, some of these challenges to, approaches to integrate, but also ways that are kind of getting in the way or barriers that have prevented some of the action that folks wanted to take, we actually found to be quite similar to these other larger reports, larger in the sense of the sort of jurisdiction that they were looking at. And so here's a few of them. First and foremost is data and metrics. When you're thinking about, and this Roy got at this with the natural asset inventories and things that MNAI can do. If you want to be able to track impact over time, you need baseline data, and you also need to see that those values that are being delivered are being counted. Also, there's a lot of different groups, a lot of environmental NGOs that track all kinds of relevant or useful ecological data, but maybe not relevant to engineers or the types of things that external investors or insurance companies are interested in. So they may have all kinds of data about, species loss, which might not be as relevant when you're thinking about flood management, for example. And so often these types of arrangements involve multiple partners. And so this need for not only data, but the right type of data for the right people and for it to be relevant to them is quite important. And obviously there's costs associated with that. There's also the issue of connecting investors to beneficiaries. And I use investors in a broad term. It could be public or private. And Anastasia got at this as well. If you're looking at what's happening in an ecosystem, and Roy mentioned this kind of idea of often there's a lot of services that have a de facto value of zero. And so if you're assessing what is being delivered and you think about perhaps changes that are happening on farmland, often it's downstream folks that are being affected. And so unless you can connect them to, be an outcome payer is a word that is often used for that benefit, it can become trickier. Alice is an example of, a recognition that there are management practices that can take place on a landscape, but without an appropriate financial incentive, it can become really hard to justify taking that action. The next one, overall capacity, skills, new strategies, it's just not easy to do things differently. It often means bringing different people together, creating new collaborative environments, and in general, it also just means that it's more costly to achieve. And so you need that leadership to want to bring people together, a willingness for people to act. And often this comes from we've seen a lot of these collaborations that have emerged from sort of more of a grassroots standpoint. And it's people doing work on the side of their desk. And this came up in some of the work that we learned about what happened in Calgary. It was, a lot of motivated city employees, but it ultimately wasn't their job, or it was sort of, they had these ad hoc committees. And then once it became mandated through their new resilience plan that this was, a high level priority for someone, then all of a sudden it was easier to generate more momentum around raising the profile of some of these issues. I already talked a little bit about jurisdictional challenges, which is not only, neighboring regions, but also going between thinking about accessing federal funding, what's happening at the provincial level, and then the range of size across different municipalities. And so, that's also something that, is just a challenge that seems to consistently arise because watersheds often do not obey political boundaries. And then this last point, I'm going to go into a little more detail on the next slide, but it's specific to infrastructure and some of these limitations that exist simply because a lot of these programs were designed in a way that really thinks about infrastructure in a pretty one-dimensional way. And I highlight that natural infrastructure projects are about, less than 10% of the approved projects in the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Program and DMAT, the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund. So on these funding restrictions, just a couple high-level points that folks may be very familiar with, which is most of the evaluation strategies, so when you're applying for funding, historically did not account for environmental co-benefits. So you could be proposing some kind of gray stormwater management infrastructure that delivered the same, let's say in this hypothetical example, services as restoring a particular wetland. That wetland, of course, also has climate benefits, there's habitat benefits, there's some level of erosion control, perhaps coastal protection, depending on where you are. But if those benefits are not counted or being asked for, then the competitiveness of a natural infrastructure project, it might have they often have some higher upfront costs, but over the lifetime of the project, significantly less expensive. But it kind of, the way that these evaluation strategies are created inherently disadvantages natural infrastructure. Another challenge for natural infrastructure are certain minimum capital requirements, because there can be quite small and local level projects that weren't able to be bundled. Private lands are usually excluded or often, and so this also can limit, what you may want to do in certain places. Often there's some level of matching funding that's required, up to 50%, and so this can also be extremely limiting. And then this idea of bundling, which I mentioned as a way to bring up that minimum capital requirement, was often quite limited across jurisdictions as well, which would be quite relevant when you're thinking about natural capital, and especially at the watershed level. The good news is, in the most recent budget, we did see some changes to DMAF, many of which had been advocated for by environmental groups and municipalities and coalitions of municipalities. There are now 2 streams. So the minimum capital requirement before was $20 million projects. Now there's a project stream allocation for 1 million to 20 million and then 20 million and up, which is intended to support some of these more localized and perhaps natural infrastructure projects. Co-benefits are now explicitly listed with some nature examples as part of the evaluation strategy. It's not clear how high that ranks as part of the evaluation strategy, but it is there. However, there are still things that are left to be desired. And one is that I think to get around some of the infrastructure challenges, they created a new infrastructure fund specifically for natural infrastructure, which on the one hand is good. I think perhaps in a perfect world, if we're thinking about transformation, to just give them their own smaller bucket does suggest that we're treating it differently rather than something that's on par with gray infrastructure and can deliver the same types of services. This other point is just talking about DMAF is really focused on disasters and less so on some of these longer term resilience strategies, and that projects, they could reflect that in their evaluation criteria a bit better, that has this longer term view, even though infrastructure in general tends to be a long-term investment. So why did this change happen? I mean, I think there's increasing and louder advocacy across the board to make the case for nature. In the context of a resilient recovery, I think this argument is made even stronger. And so just a few examples here, I won't go through them all, but job creation, which is a big concern. Ecosystem restoration in particular is something that requires a lot of labor. It can be labor in rural areas where often creating new jobs is challenging. There's a bunch of different economic studies that have talked about how restoration can deliver in an economic context, and there's various multipliers. These are American examples, and we're working on some Canadian ones. And this is an Ontario study that was done, but it just looked at how the green infrastructure sector, and by green, most of the examples there were natural, was responsible for more than 120,000 jobs and 8.3 billion in GDP. From an economic standpoint, recognizing that municipalities are pretty cash strapped, the long-term cost savings associated with natural infrastructure is understood, and I'd say growing in terms of the evidence base. And then just in general, as I highlighted before, investing in conservation and restoration in various ways helps deliver some of these larger targets that Canada has. And so justifying different pools of money contributing to achieving or delivering natural infrastructure supports a variety of different objectives. The other thing that I think is supporting some of this shift and some of this attention are new actors paying attention. From Anastasia, we heard a bit about folks in the financial sector, and that comes down to creating projects that are investable and appealing to them. And we can talk about this more in the panel discussion if folks are interested. As Roy highlighted, with standards and the Public Services Accounting Board, for example, are changing the way that they think about natural assets. There's all kinds of things that can happen within building codes when we think about the level of investment that's going into sort of green buildings and green infrastructure, whether it's green roof requirements, whether it's permeable surfaces, stormwater credits associated with addressing different types of natural infrastructure for water regulation. The insurance sector, which I mentioned, and that's one that it makes a ton of sense given the rising costs of climate change, and thinking about not only are municipalities insured, but also businesses that exist within municipalities and all of the buildings and flood risk and rising costs of flooding in particular. Although if we think about rural areas, also the rising cost of drought. And so for them to invest in strategies that are going to reduce that risk and reduce potential payouts down the line, all of a sudden the justification for that investment can make a lot of sense. And they are among the actors being most vocal on seeing more action at the federal level. And so I just wanted to touch on an example that's a bit like some of the stuff that Anastasia was talking about, maybe bring it to thinking about what something like this could look like in Albertan context in terms of these new actors and new investors. This is an example of a model that's happening in California. So similar in the sense of increased fire risk, increased drought, and how do we connect the dots between what ecosystems can deliver in terms of services and who benefits from those services. And so this forest resilience bond was created, and the idea is that there are people providing upfront dollars to do restoration activities. Those restoration activities, we know, based on sort of scientific studies, have clear, benefits for fire suppression and water, maintaining water in the system, both quality and quantity. And so the beneficiaries of that, which are municipalities, which are electric utilities, who are often the ones that have infrastructure getting damaged, are the ones that are making annual payments back towards this bond. And the idea is that over the course of 10 years, making their $1 million payment a year, their judging is going to be cheaper for them. So 10 million in this example over the course of 10 years, then they're banking on the idea that 10 million will be less than what they would have had to shell out, or the difference of the cost of a disaster. So it's not to say that fires won't happen or that there might not be water challenges, but that these restoration activities are delivering a benefit that exceeds what they're paying out. And so it is sort of an investment in the future. And then what those beneficiaries are paying out delivers a return to those upfront investors. And so that's just a creative way to connect different set of financing options to people who are delivering specific activities on the ground. So overall, and we can talk about this, and I'm sure we will further in the panel, when it comes to scaling natural infrastructure, I think there's a lot of opportunities. The first is leadership and prioritization. Within making it part of mandates, having leadership within municipalities, recognizing this is something that's important, that it should be priorities for staff members. I'm part of a national roundtable on adaptation leading into Canada's new adaptation strategy that's going to be delivered next fall. And I guess something that I just think is promising on the leadership standpoint is that there's a real emphasis on thinking about infrastructure as a system. So not in terms of the assets themselves, but also what enables the delivery of those assets. And I think by thinking about it more systematically is going to encourage the inclusion of things like natural infrastructure. These next two are related, which is valuing natural capital. And this comes into the actual way that we quantify and account for it, and gets at some of these issues like standards and timelines that have come up earlier. There's also regulations that can apply at the local level in terms of bylaws and codes about what's required when development happens with respect to existing nature or the inclusion of natural infrastructure. The other thing that can be controlled locally are some of these stewardship programs that can reward people for participating, and that's a way to get at private lands. There's also a need, of course, in all of this to support capacity building at the municipal level and beyond. And so there's a question of where some of that financial support may come from. And these last couple points relate to that. One is, I think, tied to the financial support is this idea that moving forward on this often involves collaboration. It's multidisciplinary. And a couple examples, this event is the kind of thing that brings people together. What Dark Matter Labs does brings multiple groups together, private and public. M&AI's inventory process forces people across a municipality to interact that may not otherwise interact, depending on the size of the municipality. And so part of it, I think, is crossing those jurisdictional boundaries or sector boundaries or expertise boundaries, because it does involve thinking about infrastructure more holistically or more systematically. And then the last point, which is tied to capacity, is guidance tools and training. And we've heard some of these tools today. And I think part of the challenge is there's so much out there. And so it's not only developing the tools, but also knowing where to find them. And so this is just a quick highlight. I heard a beep on my computer. I don't know if someone's trying to tell me to stop or I've hit my time. I think I'm getting there. So I'll wrap things up. But this is just to highlight, this is Green Infrastructure Ontario's page. I tried to find something similar to Alberta, so I apologize if it exists, and I didn't find it. But this is a page that summarizes, there's hundreds of resources. The toolkits and guides, I think there's 25 plus, some of which are regional in focus, but many of which could apply anywhere. And so part of it is understanding, what are the tools I need to understand what I'm trying to do in my specific context. And I just wanted to close with an example of a tool that we are building. And this is the Greenbelt region in Ontario. And so somewhat analogous in the sense that thinking about agricultural regions that surround some of these more built environments, where we want to create, or we are creating, some blueprints for municipalities to think about how they can attract public-private investment in conserving and restoring the Greenbelt region. And so it is about looking at understanding the assets that you have, developing appropriate models that meet the needs of the various stakeholders, and then creating something that is scalable and replicable. And so we'll let you know when these are published, and hopefully some of the findings and the step-by-step guidance around who to bring together and when and at what stage can be useful outside of this region as well. So thank you very much, and look forward to the panel.
Great. Thanks so much, Dr. Olmsted. I thought you again gave us so much to think about in terms of really starting to think about infrastructure as a system. And that was very illuminating. In the interest of time, we're going to take a couple of questions. So we've got a question. Somebody asked, do you see investment in natural assets the same way we would see investment in industrial development? Money is put into a project that fuels jobs and lifestyle, or is it viewed differently? Are you able to speak to that?
Sure, and this could be something that Roy might want to, or others may want to weigh in on. I do think it's similar in the sense that we should think about it in terms of what it delivers. And it doesn't just deliver ecosystem services. It definitely can deliver jobs. It definitely can deliver economic returns. And I think there's pros and cons of that perspective, because we don't want to, the risk, or what environmental groups get concerned about is that the over monetization or commoditization or putting nature in the same terms as other things devalues the inherent value in nature, which can go beyond the fact that it provides clean water and clean air, but cultural values, places we just want to spend time. But when we're talking about natural infrastructure, I do think it makes sense to absolutely put it in that same context, because when you evaluate them on those terms, you actually are recognizing the range of things that it can deliver. And so I think mainstreaming nature into that perspective will help highlight to folks that are kind of the unconvinced, when you're comparing apples to apples in a sense, in terms of the metrics, can be helpful to deliver that message or make that business case.
Thank you. So we've got one more question before we head into the panel discussion. The question: structure funds available to municipalities or individual companies, for example, private?
So infrastructure funds, if we're thinking about some of these national programs, are certainly available to municipalities. Often it is, depending on the scale of the project, it could be in partnership with a project, but there are, or as part of a region. But yeah, I mean, they support stormwater management, looking at how different, whether dams get constructed or not. I mean, often the ISIP program, the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Program, it has a green stream. That green stream is primarily focused on water management. And I think if it has to do with water management, they call it green. It doesn't mean that it's natural infrastructure. And in fact, as I noted, most things are not. When it comes to individual companies, I mean, they would get contracted as part of those arrangements. But what I think where there's some potential is for the types of projects that aren't traditionally seen as infrastructure, like wetland restoration. This is where bringing in new types of partners or actors that we don't normally think about as capital providers for infrastructure, like insurance companies, can engage.
Okay, thanks so much for that. That's all of the questions that I'm seeing in the chat right now. If you have any additional questions, hopefully Dr. Olmsted and some of our other panelists will be able to address them. So I will now